All right. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. We had a previous webinar with Alan. Alan's back today to talk a bit about sea level rise and a bit more about what the Clean Coast team is working on. Previously, the other webinar was on carbon sequestration and blue carbon, and that can be found up on our website if anyone missed the last one and wants to take it in. It's at cleanclimatecommunities.ca. But with that, I'll throw it over to our restoration specialist, Alan. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just get started with sharing my screen and hopefully that goes well. So if you attended the blue carbon presentation, you'll see a couple slides that are the same, just because I always like to go over, what are salt marshes and kind of the basics of coastal ecology, just so that we're always starting from like the same page kind of thing. But yeah, with that, I'm part of the Clean Coast team at the Clean Foundation. I'm the restoration specialist on the project. A little background on me and why I'm here talking to you today. I'm a biology student at the University of New Brunswick. I'm currently working on finishing up my master's degree on coastal ecology, and I'm so close. So that's it's just so close. I'm really excited. Sorry. We've got a couple other people on our team. Charlene Robertson is our project manager. Logan Horrocks is our GIS specialist. So a lot of the maps you'll see today were made by him. And Julia Stoughton is our engagement specialist. So a little background on our current project. We are currently in the midst of filling out applications all over the place to expand the work that we're doing. But currently we're funded by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. We're one of the CRF recipients, if you're familiar with that funding pool. The goals of our project are to restore tidal wetland habitat, or it's also called salt marsh habitat. We're looking to engage with communities, which I think is exactly what we're doing here today. We try our best to share whatever data we collect. So if you go to our website, you'll find links to like data dumps that we have, where you can download any of the data that we've collected on water quality and things like that. And we're also looking to build capacity. So we're not just looking to do this work ourselves, but we really want to encourage others who want to see this work continued to take it on themselves. We've got quite a few local and international partners, and we're always looking for more. This is just a sheet with most of them, but certainly not all of the partners that we have worked with and are looking to work with in the near future. So if you're interested in partnering, feel free to reach out and we can see what we can align our interests with. So very quickly getting into the basics of salt marsh ecology and coastal ecology. I'm going to be talking a lot about salt marshes today because that's been the focus of our project, but I will also be talking more about the larger scale ramifications of sea level rise later in the presentation. But at its most basic, where do we find salt marshes? We find salt marshes along the coast. So if you think of the coast of the Maritimes, you probably picture sandy beaches or rocky shorelines. But included in that, most people don't think of this, are salt marshes. They're grassy, flat spaces where the tides come up and flood them every single day. So in this infographic, we're looking at the intertidal zone. So at low tide, the water's down here, the salt marsh is exposed to the air completely, and at high tide, that water comes up and goes to the supertidal zone and completely floods over the surface of the intertidal zone or the salt marsh. When we look at a salt marsh, like I said, they're flat and they're just filled with grass, so most people kind of don't even notice them. They're pretty innocuous. They're dominated by grasses, sedges, and rushes. So you won't find any hard woody stemmed plants growing in salt marshes. It's just going to look like a field of grass. But they have really interesting properties. So when you look at a salt marsh like this, you'll often see what's going on here, where on the right half of this figure, you'll see one type of grass that's completely dominating this space. When you look at the left-hand side of this picture, you see this other one species of grass that's completely dominating this space. And it forms this like zipper right down the length of the marsh. So this is actually the low marsh, and this is the high marsh. Even though it looks very flat, there's a very slight increase in elevation as you go from the right half of the picture to the left. And that has a small effect on how often these spaces are being flooded by the tides and for how long the tides are sitting in that zone. So tidal water, obviously salty, it's hard for plants to live in. So that's what determines why you get these different zones of like pretty clearly defined grasses. This grass can handle being flooded more regularly. This grass can't. So oftentimes, when I'm talking about sea level rise and changing tidal, like average tidal heights, keep this picture in mind because you're going to see big changes in what the salt marshes look like and how they're functioning based on those tidal heights. So some other fun characteristics of salt marshes, again, it's where the land is being routinely inundated by the tides. So if you look at these two photos here, they're actually taken from the exact same place. One of them was taken at low tide down here, and you can see the water is just barely filling this creek, whereas at high tide, the water has filled that creek and has actually spilled over the surface of the marsh. Not the grass itself, but it's certainly over top of the mud of the marsh. Some interesting properties that this gives the marsh is that the soils of the marsh actually remain waterlogged at all times. The soil of the marsh is saturated with water. And an interesting property of oxygen is that it actually moves through water fairly slowly. So in the marsh, these plants are consuming the oxygen in the soils and in the air. And so as you dig into the marsh, you're going to see at the top couple centimeters, you're going to see this brown mud. But once you get a couple centimeters down, the brown mud turns to black mud. And it's black because you've hit this anoxic layer in the mud. There's no oxygen down there. And so the decay rate of organic materials that get down into the marsh slows very, very significantly. So anything that gets buried in the marsh decays slowly. I usually throw out a joke here about if you're a serial killer, a marsh would be a bad place to hide the evidence because it's going to preserve that evidence for hundreds to thousands of years, possibly. I originally had a picture here of what's called the bog body or the Tolland man, but I had some people ask me to not share that image. It's a little disturbing, but it was a body that was buried in a peat bog, and it's a freshwater system, but it's still undergoing a lot of the same principles of preserving anything that's buried in it. So if you feel adventurous, I recommend you go Google the Tolland man. It's a 2,300-year-old body that's like perfectly preserved. You can still see the definition in the man's face as he was, laid to rest there. So getting into how salt marshes grow, this is really important in understanding the impacts of sea level rise on this habitat type. So salt marshes do two things. They accrete vertically and they migrate inland. So the way they accrete vertically is like this. The tidal water comes in, gets high, it floods over the surface of the marsh, and there's little bits of sand and soil that's in that water. If you think of the Bay of Fundy, it almost looks like chocolate milk on some days, and that's because there's so much sediment in the water. So as the tidal water gets into the marsh, it encounters this thick growth of grass. That thick growth of grass is actually going to slow the water down, and it's going to slow the water down so much so that those little fine bits of sand can settle out of the water, bind to the surface of the marsh, and little by little, millimeter by millimeter, these marshes actually grow themselves up vertically. And it's been shown that given adequate conditions, salt marshes are actually able to compete with the rate of sea level rise. They can actually build themselves up vertically as fast as sea level rise is increasing. And that's really important because it means that they're continuing to exist and provide the benefits that we get from them in a totally passive way. But again, that is only under the right conditions. So the other thing that salt marshes do is they migrate inland. So as sea level rise continues to get bigger and bigger, the tidal water is going to be able to reach further and further inland, where it's going to kill those plants and trees that can't handle living in salt water. And that creates space for that salt marsh to then move in and take over that space. So they do two things: they accrete vertically and they migrate inland. We get a lot of ecological benefits from salt marshes. They provide habitat for many different kinds of wildlife. They act as fish nurseries and migratory rest stops, nesting spots, and feeding habitats for birds and fish and all kinds of invertebrates. There's a particular species of mussel that lives in salt marshes. And some species actually exclusively rely on salt marsh habitat to exist. So this photo up here is a picture of a willet. This is a bird species that only nests in salt marsh habitat. So without salt marshes, we wouldn't have willets. There's also been a fair bit of research that shows that salt marshes help to provide for nearby ecosystems and food webs. So where you have a salt marsh producing fish and birds, it's a direct benefit to those systems like estuaries and tidal rivers that are right next to those salt marshes, because the salt marshes themselves are just so productive. They also do a lot for us in terms of coastal stabilization. And the key here is to have healthy grasses, because healthy grasses put out a lot of root matter, and that root matter goes to bind sediment in place. So if you look at this picture in the upper right here, you'll see this is a picture of one of the salt marsh grasses that's been pulled up. And you can see just how extensive this root mat is that they put out. It does a lot to hold sediment in place and prevent erosion. I mentioned before that they can rise at a similar pace to sea level. So that's a really important thing. And it means that they're continually providing these benefits. They've been shown to help improve water quality and reduce the effects of runoff. Like I said, there's mussels that grow in salt marshes, and oysters, and the plants themselves, and bacteria and fungi that are helping to pull nutrients that get into them out of the system. So some places in the States have actually started looking at using salt marshes as buffers for, say, agricultural operations, where nitrogen fertilizer is being used on a farmland, and they don't want to get into the water. So there's this buffer of salt marsh that can handle taking that nitrogen and using it without disrupting the processes going on in the water. Like I said before, salt marshes also help to protect our infrastructure. And it's because they're helping to prevent erosion, and they're helping to dampen the waves that are coming into the marsh. I've actually got a little example of that. This is a video I took in northern Nova Scotia. So if you look at the water out here, you can see the waves of the water are fairly high. It's a bit of a choppy day, but that water is passing through the grasses right here. And in this clear patch right here, you can see the water here is actually very, very calm. That's just a little bit of grass that's providing that much of a dampening effect to the waves. So salt marshes are continually providing that erosion mitigation to our shorelines. Salt marshes also go on to help support recreation, tourism, and a strong commercial fishery. Like I said, salt marshes help provide for the spaces around them, and that includes places, fisheries that are near salt marshes. They tend to act as like the bottom of the food web, producing lots of bait fish and things that go on to support the larger fish that we like to fish and eat. Salt marshes are also special places of value for traditional cultural activities. These activities include fishing, hunting, trapping, and gathering medicines. And on that last point, where salt marshes exist in this interesting space between freshwater and saltwater, they actually have a fair number of very unique plant species that grow there, and many of those have been traditionally and are still being used as medicines today. So what impacts are salt marshes facing these days? One of the big ones, and one of the ones that our project has focused a lot of efforts on, is tidal restrictions, which is anytime you alter the hydrology or anytime you alter how water is moving into and out of a space. So you picture that field of grass with the two species of grass on it. Any change, any small change you make to the hydrology, how the water is moving into and out of that marsh, is going to have big impacts on what that marsh looks like and how it's functioning. This often brings itself up in the form of tidal restrictions like undersized culverts or roads that are in the way, or dikes that are just trying to keep that tidal water out of a space. Historically, less so these days, but it's still not unheard of, is the practice of infilling, which is just taking sediment from somewhere and dumping it on a salt marsh to bring that marsh out of the tidal frame so that the tides are no longer flooding it every day. And that obviously results in the direct loss of any salt marsh habitat that you do that to. Pollution is often a concern because it leads to effects like eutrophication, which is nutrients get into a water source and it creates harmful algal blooms that then lead to mass mortality of fish. And if anybody has questions on how all that works, I can go into more detail, but essentially pollution is bad for our purposes. So historical terrain alterations are also a really big one for our province. We've got a long history of changing what our coastline looks like, especially in the extensive diking that we've done for agricultural purposes and continue to do for agricultural purposes. But even when these dikes are left to just to their own devices, if they're abandoned and left to fall apart on their own, they can still be posing interesting and sometimes big negative impacts to these salt marshes and the natural functioning that should be happening there. I saved this one for last because this one is most relevant when we talk about sea level rise, which is that coastal development and hardened shorelines can lead to a process called coastal squeeze. So I brought this picture back. And one thing I didn't point out before is that there's this dike, this earthen barrier that runs along the left-hand side of this picture. With sea level rise, what can happen is we have higher tides coming in, and you can imagine that with higher tides, this low marsh is going to migrate further and further to the left. It's changing the zipper, pushing it to the left because the average high tide is now over here. But what that's doing is that's actually squeezing out this high marsh because the high marsh can't get past this barrier. So it just gets smaller and smaller until it eventually disappears. That's pretty bad because that's a reduction in salt marsh processing. It's a reduction in ecological diversity. But the more significant and devastating impact is if that sea level continues to rise further and further, and now this part of the marsh can no longer sustain grasses because it's too far underwater, and it continues and continues until we now no longer have any grasses growing here. Without grasses growing there, there's nothing to hold all this sediment in place. That sediment gets washed out to sea, causing all kinds of negative impacts. And now your dike is working itself right up against the tides. There's no buffer to prevent the tides from splashing straight into your dike and eroding it. So I'm going to switch gears and talk much more about sea level rise and how we can be addressing it in Nova Scotia. A lot of this information that I'm presenting comes straight from Canada's Marine Coast and a Changing Climate. I highly recommend this book. It was a 2016 NRCan compendium of climate change research and recommendations, and it has a whole chapter on what the East Coast can be doing. You can find it online for free right here. And one thing you'll see in this presentation is I try to include as many resources as possible. So I'll definitely share this presentation around afterwards so that everybody can just click on the links and go to these different sites and resources. So in a single slide, what is sea level rise? We know that the Earth is getting warmer due to climate change. This is causing the polar ice caps and glaciers to melt. And if you think about just how much water is stored in those glaciers and polar ice caps, 70% of all the fresh water on Earth is being stored in those. So you can imagine that's a ton of water that's no longer in a solid state, is now getting into the ocean. And that's doing a lot to raise the sea levels all over the world. The other process that's happening, that's having like one of the main effects, is that uh, as water gets warmer, it actually expands. It's thermal expansion, and this is a process that you see in all materials, and water's no exception. So as water gets hotter, which it is, it takes up more volume. Um, we are living in a special scenario because not only are the sea levels rising, but Atlantic Canada is actually subsiding. The whole of our land mass is sinking, and this is a natural process of glaciation that I probably can't get into. I'm not a geologist, I'm a biologist by trade, so I probably couldn't explain it as well as I would like to. But this map here is taken straight out of that Anarcan report, and we can see red colors are indicating areas of higher sea level rise predictions. And we can see that Atlantic Canada sticks out like a sore thumb. It's because we have this compounding effect of sea level rise hitting us as well as us sinking. So it's this double whammy. And you can actually see parts of Canada are expected to actually have sea level drop just because of these same subsidence and growth processes. When we zoom in on Atlantic Canada and we just say, within Atlantic Canada, where are the areas that are expected to see most of the impact of sea level rise? Again, Nova Scotia sticks out like a sore thumb. So even amongst the worst case scenario, we are in the worst case scenario. So it's definitely something of concern, in Nova Scotia. So what are the risks we're facing when it comes to sea level rise? The biggest one, not the biggest one, but one of the big ones is higher tides and higher average tides. We can also expect to see increased magnitude of storm events. That might be because the storms are themselves bigger than usual, but it's also could be because our tides are higher, and so we're just getting that double whammy of those two combined effects, creating more problems for us. We're probably looking at infrastructure damage due to sea level rise. We're absolutely looking at habitat loss due to sea level rise. Due more to climate change than particularly sea level rise, we can expect to see more frequent and more severe storms. And I bring up saltwater intrusion last because I think it's actually something that I don't hear people talking about enough. It's this idea that, as tidal heights get higher, obviously saltwater can reach further and further inland. So that's going to impact wells, it's going to impact agriculture. And I bring up this Maryland example because what's happening in Maryland is they're seeing the effects of sea level rise. They're seeing the saltwater intrusion, but it's not that the saltwater is coming over the land. It's actually getting into the groundwater and seeping into farms that are maybe not exactly adjacent to coastal systems. So saltwater intrusion is definitely something that's on my mind personally quite a bit. And I'm sure I don't have to explain that, coastal resilience matters and that, the coasts matter to our population here in Nova Scotia. This map here is showing civic addresses all across Nova Scotia. So each dot is where somebody lives. And we can see from this map that 70% of Nova Scotia's population lives in coastal communities. So when we're talking about the coasts of Nova Scotia being impacted by sea level rise, we're also talking about 70% of our population. So it's this huge, huge issue. And we also have this additional tangled web of 86% of our coastline being privately owned. So this map here is showing in white is privately owned land along our coast. So it raises a lot of questions about how do we engage with communities, how do we get people on board for adapting and for making changes, and how do we fund it all? And I certainly don't have those answers as a biologist, so I just put them out there. But what I do want to go over is the recommendations that we have on how we can be adapting. The first thing is to collect accurate data. So I'm going to spend a couple slides talking about LiDAR. I'm sorry if everybody already knows what LiDAR is, or if you don't, great. another thing that we should be considering, though, is monitoring tidal water levels. We do have some tide stations across Nova Scotia, but you know, in order to have as accurate data as we can, we should have more, and we should probably be looking to maintain them as best we can. And then once we have accurate data, we need to weigh the options that we have. And generally, the options that we have get sorted into these 4 categories, which is to do nothing, to avoid and retreat from risky areas, to protect an area, or to accommodate the flooding. And so I'll talk quite a bit about those in a little bit here. So what is LiDAR and how does it let us see any better than with our eyes or with a regular camera? This is a map that I pulled up on Google Earth. So this was made using traditional photographic mapping or satellite imagery mapping. It's taking lots of photos of the ground, it's stitching those photos together, and it shows us what the ground looks like. So it's great for seeing what an area looks like. But one thing it's not showing us is what does the ground look like. It's because it's being obscured by the vast tree cover we have here. So that's where LiDAR mapping comes in. LiDAR is a technology where it's a camera that shoots laser beams. The laser beams can go through certain materials like trees and plants. And so by using this, we can actually map out what the ground itself looks like rather than just what the tree canopy looks like. So I included these pins in the map, these yellow and red pins, to show you the same location on each map so you can see how they line up. These are maps of the same location. The way this LiDAR map works is that lighter colors show a higher elevation. And something that stands out to me when I look at these maps is we can see this pretty vast gully right here where there's this dark line. This is some sort of gully or creek, something like that, that's in the side of this hill that was completely obscured in the traditional mapping photos. So once we have this LiDAR mapping, we can create 3D maps and 3D models of our sites or our populations or towns or whatever, and we can then simulate sea level rise projections to see what is going to be at risk in 30 to 80 years. If you're looking for this data, you can go to GeoNova. I've included some links here. And this map up top here shows where LiDAR data is freely publicly available. So this is really great. I mean, they've got quite extensive coverage of the coast and of Nova Scotia. I would say, though, like for us in particular, we only do our work thus far in the Northumberland Strait, so this area right here, and we cannot scream loud enough that we need LiDAR coverage for the work that we want to do and the work that we need to do. So right now, we're actually looking into how much it would cost to buy a drone that has LiDAR capabilities, and then we could start doing LiDAR mapping ourselves on smaller scales. Generally, this mapping here would have been done in a small plane. But going back to that example, so we can see now we can map out accurately on this regular map where we're seeing different topographic features, and we can see through the plant cover. So again, from here, we can go on to make our 3D models of the ground and then simulate sea level rise. So this here is an example of what the UPEI Climate Lab has put out. It's a program called CLIVE. I believe you can go online and download it for free if you want to. Right now, it only has PEI coverage, but essentially they've taken all this LiDAR data from all across PEI and put it into this simulator. So you can fly around in virtual space and you can manually change what the sea level rise or what the sea level is at. So you can make predictions about, by 2030, say, this building is going to be partly underwater. So this ends up resulting in us making informed decision making about how we best adapt our coastlines to sea level rise, because our coastlines are extremely varied, and we're absolutely not going to be able to apply a one solution fits all kind of take on adapting our coastlines. So we really should be using this kind of information to then look at our options, which are, again, to do nothing, to avoid and retreat from risky areas, to protect, or to accommodate for flooding. And I find this little infographic helps quite a bit in visualizing it all. So this is current sea level rise, or not rise, sorry, but current sea level along this solid line. And then in each of these examples, we're looking at predicted sea level rise with the dashed line. So our options are ultimately to protect what infrastructure is there. This means to build our walls taller or harder to keep the water out of low-lying areas. We can learn to accommodate flooding. So essentially, this is plan for places to flood occasionally, or we can retreat and just stay out of those areas that we know are going to be risky in the future. So I'll go more in depth with all of these options. So starting off with the do nothing option, it actually might be harder than we might be thinking because in a lot of cases, we've already done something. We've already built roads along most of our coastline. And if we were to just leave those roads in place, we're going to be introducing unintended barriers to the migration of these coastal systems as they move inland. And we're going to be bringing on our own, further negative impacts from that. So like in this example here, I mean, this is a road that's obviously not being used. The coast has come in, it's trying to move inland and it's eroding away this road. So, obviously we shouldn't be trying to replace this probably, but to just leave it in place also means that we're negatively impacting this beach. It's getting squeezed into smaller and smaller space as it tries to destroy this road to keep itself alive, kind of thing. There are definitely arguments for doing nothing in some cases. A big one that comes to my mind is that erosion is actually a natural process. Some erosion is needed in areas for our coastal habitats to function properly. If you think about the salt marsh growth that I brought up earlier, where it accretes sediment over time, if there is zero sediment in the water, it obviously cannot do that. So if we were really extensive and we built bulkheads along every inch of our shorelines, that would cut off all erosion, but it would also mean that there's no sediment to have these habitats continue to function. And this is actually something that we've seen in heavily developed cities in the US time and time again. A lot of these cities are struggling now with the extent of armoring that they've done on their shorelines. It's to a point where they're looking at taking material like soil material from other places and dumping it on marshes to bring them up to the right space so that those marshes can still exist. The next option is avoiding risky areas or retreating from them. And this is actually one of the main aspects of the Coastal Protection Act from what I can gather. I'm not working on the Coastal Protection Act, but I'm trying to keep up to date with it. And these were some of the quotes I pulled out of an article from the Chronicle Herald. The CPA is looking to protect coastal ecosystems by avoiding unnecessary interference with the dynamic nature of the coast. We're not asking anyone to move a structure. The principle here is we're trying to avoid additional risk. So it seems to me like the CPA, the way it's going to be introduced, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the way it's going to be introduced is to prevent private landowners from building additional structures or making significant upgrades to structures that are in areas of high risk due to sea level rise erosion. So, I generally am in favor of that. I don't think it makes sense to allow people to build in spaces that we know are going to be at risk because that's just going to be creating further problems for the province further down the road. The next option, protecting the shoreline. So shoreline armoring is often our default practice, but whenever we use one solution to fix all problems, we generally tend to create new problems for ourselves. This figure here was pulled out of that NRCan report. It's just showing the extent of hard shoreline armoring that's been done in the province that has been reported. And we can see there's hundreds and hundreds of examples of bulkheads and riprap. And some of the problems that come with hard armor structures is that it pushes the erosion effects onto your neighbors, onto others around you. And this is because, say I live on the coastline and I have an erosion problem. I go and dump rocks on the edge of my shore so that it stops eroding, it stops pushing back inland. Well, those waves are still coming at my property. And the problem is that now they're hitting those rocks and being deflected onto my neighbor's property. So now my neighbors are going to have, increased erosion problems, and they need to armor their shores. So this idea of armoring everything, it just leads to further armament, and we know that can lead to issues down the road with starving our marshes of sediment, which can have, larger impacts on the productivity of fisheries and things like this. This was a project that our team took on. So what happened here is this is a tidal river that runs up this direction. Our team came in and replaced some failing culverts that were in the road here with this bridge structure. And we noticed in the winter when we were here that there's quite a bit of brown here, and it's brown because it's eroding. There's just no grass or hay there that should have stayed in place but didn't. And so we're seeing the soil in the road here run off, which eventually can lead to a structural failure of the bridge. So we needed to address this. And we didn't want to just dump a bunch of rocks on it, which might have fixed the problem, but we certainly didn't want to take that approach. So instead we got a bunch of natural materials that are biodegradable. We got logs, spruce leaves, and bales of hay, things like that. We staked them in place using wooden stakes, and the idea with this is that these materials are going to help hold all that sediment in place. It's going to give time for the plants under those materials to grow and start to stabilize the bank. And over time, as this salt marsh that's in front of the bank here, as it wants to migrate inland with sea level rise, it can. And there's no hard structure in place that it can't get through. So this is just the end result of what this looks like. So this was a fairly cheap alternative to simply dumping rock, and so far it's proved very successful. The next option is to accommodate flooding. So essentially this means just allowing occasional flooding to take place around whatever you're building. Most often, this seems to be an option when protection costs are prohibitive, or even when retreat is prohibitive. And this is kind of an exciting one because it usually involves the most outside of the box thinking. Some examples include building on stilts. So your buildings are raised up out of the tidal frame so that space underneath them can flood without damaging the houses. This could also come up as a robust stormwater management system, an example of which are retention ponds, so that when flooding occurs, that flooding water has somewhere to go without causing widespread damage to your roads and your buildings. And another one that is becoming more common, especially in the Bay of Fundy, is what's called managed realignment. And I bring up Olac, New Brunswick as an example. So what was happening at this site, this was, for the last couple hundred years, this has been an agricultural farmland. There was an old dike that ran along the edge of the coast here that protected this agricultural land from being flooded by the tides. So the tides come in from the right and flood over the land like here. This old dike was falling apart. It needed to be replaced or repaired extensively. So it was decided that instead of just trying to hold the line there, what they would do is actually build a new dike that's like several hundred meters back from the old one and allow this space in between the new and the old dike to revegetate and turn back into a salt marsh habitat. And this really seems like a win-win scenario where you're allowing for salt marsh habitat to exist where it historically did and it still wants to. It's increasing productivity of fish in the area and of plants in the area. And it's also providing that buffering benefit to protect your new dike that you just spent tons of money to build. That grass is going to help protect against the tides from buffering battering against your new dike. You also get to keep some protected farmland in behind. And I do think that this is going to become even more common as time goes on, in part just because Department of Agriculture currently maintains over 240 kilometers of dikes in the Bay of Fundy. And a recent study as of 2018 found that 70% of these dikes are actually at high or very high risk of failure by 2050 due to sea level rise. Some other things that they found in the report was that all salt marsh habitat that's in front of those dikes is expected to be lost by that time as well. So we're talking about widespread loss of habitat and potential damage. And these dikes are not cheap to maintain or to build. So I do think that managed realignment projects are likely to become more common going forward, since they can provide these win-win scenarios. And certainly, if anybody is living on the Bay of Fundy and knows of some interesting spaces where this might be an applicable solution, please feel free to reach out to us or some of the other partners that I'm going to recommend here. So I hope I wasn't too doom and gloom in this presentation. Hearing it in my head as I go through it now, I'm like, ooh, that sounds really horrible. I do want to give solutions to these problems, and I also wanted people to know who they can turn to for information on these topics, as well as who they can turn to for some solutions. So internationally, you can stay up to date with the IPCC, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They put out reports. I believe they put out an annual report, and then they put out very robust ones every half decade or so. If you're looking for information that's closer to home, the Canadian government, Natural Resources Canada, has really good resources, and Environment and Climate Change Canada is obviously up to date on a lot of information. If you're looking for local resources, there's GeoNova and Data Nova Scotia for a lot of your LiDAR data and your climate data. If you're looking for research leaders, there's Gail Shimura out of the Department of Geography at McGill. There's Adam Fennick out of the UPEI Climate Lab. Danica Van Proostage is the Maritime Provinces Spatial Analysis Research Center leader at SMU. Jeff Ollerhead is a professor at the Geography and Environment Department at Mount Allison. There's also an organization that's up and coming called Transcoastal Adaptations, and I believe they're trying to be a one-stop shop for coastal solutions. And then there's also Tim Webster out of the Geomatics research team at NSCC. And I bring him up last just because I wanted to give a shout out to one of his programs that he has put out. This is freely available online. The coverage at the moment is still pretty patchy. It's more, if you look in highly populated areas like Halifax, for example, you'll see maps that work in his program. But this is just a coastal flooding risk map. So you can go to different parts along the coast of Maritimes, and you can simulate sea level rise and see what kinds of infrastructure are likely to be at risk from this. So this is a great program to be aware of. With that, I just wanted to say thanks for attending. I really appreciate you sitting through what can be kind of a dry topic. And I'll certainly share this presentation afterwards so that all of these resources are freely available to anybody who wants them. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Not really a question, probably more a comment. Mike Johnson, Emergency Management in Cumberland County. Interesting to see your graphic on the dikes, the four dike, the old dike and the new dike, and how that thing operates. We're 3/4 of the way into some dike enhancement work that's being done in the Advocate area. We had an analysis of that area done by an engineering firm, and they're looking at enhancing the dike up by 1 meter. And of course, they're looking at adding directly on top of the existing dike. I'm not sure whether they even consider the possibility of having a secondary dike as opposed to just adding to the primary one. I think there's a number of things at play, including the cost of doing so might be one of the major contributing factors to that. But just interesting to see that option of having that dual dike and how they work in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely something that's been cropping up more and more. That example I showed there, it was in Olac, New Brunswick. If you ever want to go, just send me an email. I'll be there. any excuse to get out. But
Love to go.
that's a project that's been ongoing for 10 years now or so, maybe a bit more now actually. But it was taken on by Ducks Unlimited in partnership with a few different universities, I believe. Really interesting projects, and more of them are cropping up. One of the people I mentioned at the end there, Danica Van Proosted, she, in partnership with an organization called CB West, they're doing quite a bit of work in that area. If you're familiar with the dikelands in the Truro area, they're doing exactly this. There was a risk assessment done for the Truro area just a few years back, where they looked at the cost-benefit analysis of different approaches to dealing with the flooding that occurs annually at Truro. And one of the things they found that was the most cost-effective was to restore some salt marsh habitat. So provide additional space for that tidal flooding water to come in and occupy a salt marsh rather than downtown Truro.
Yep.
Yeah.
I know they've done a lot of work up there, including they dredged the river at one point to increase the flow so that the siltation deposits wouldn't remain. And that apparently had a significant impact. So some good work done there. She's also part of EOS out of Sackville, and I know I go over there for some of the meetings they have there. So I'd love to get out and see some of the other projects they have in the go in the Sackville area.
Yeah. How are we doing? Any other questions come up?
Feel free to unmute your mic or throw it in the chat, and I can present them to Alan as well.
Alan, I'll ask any tips on how we better communicate some of these ideas to homeowners in the area, because that's a real challenge. People that have built nearby their dream house, they're going to be really resistant, understandably, and then they are voters as well, which causes that political ripple effect. And it's a real challenge. But have you experienced any of this?
Yeah, it's definitely like an ongoing debate. Even at Clean, Logan and I talk back and forth quite a bit on, how do you approach landowners and tell them that, we're estimating that in 50 years, your house is going to be underwater. Do you do that directly, or do you bring visuals? It's a really complicated question, and I think that's why there hasn't been any unified effort. I've definitely seen the full gambit of how that kind of communication is done. So I brought up the Clive program from UPEI, where they have a 3D model of the entirety of PEI, and they can simulate sea level rise projections in different areas. They actually spent quite a while touring around to different communities and showing this program for each specific community and saying, where's your house, sir? Let's look at it in 50 years. And it's you don't want to cause panic is one of the things, but you want people to be informed. I think that the CPA, the Coastal Protection Act, is a good first start. But like you said, people building houses are voters. So obviously, the CPA isn't looking to ruffle any feathers. It's just looking to prevent any further increases in risk. So I think it's a good start. I'm personally on the side of being more direct with people. Even when I've been going out to marshes and doing my assessment work, I run into people who say, well, sea level rise isn't real. And it's like, you're telling me that your property is eroding. It's never done that before. You're having all these issues that you can't explain. And then you say sea level rise isn't real. And there needs to be to me, I think there needs to be a big push for education and just kind of a I don't know, tough love approach, I guess, taken to it, because the message needs to get out there to some people. One thing, I'm sorry if I know I'm ranting on this question, but another thing that comes up often is that insurance companies are absolutely paying close attention to these details and these projections, and people that are currently have their house insured might not forever, because they're going to be living in areas of extremely high risk in 20 to 80 years. So that might be another thing that just forces people's hands. Well, I guess I must have given a pretty clear presentation. If you feel the need to ask questions after the fact too, please reach out. I can be reached at abeck@clean.ns.ca. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see any further questions at the moment. So I do see Terry dropped a couple links there into the meeting chat. I might want to check those out at some point when you have the chance. We can maybe send those out along with the presentation as well.
I didn't have any questions, but I just want to say thank you. I've tried to kind of follow the Coastal Protection Act for a long time, so I am quite familiar with it, hence the lack of questions. But it's good to hear how things are going because Mahone Bay's coastline is essentially fully developed. We talk about redevelopment in the footprint, but it's not quite the same everywhere. So anyway, I appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and thank you very much, Alan, for your presentation.
Hey, thank you. Thanks everyone again for attending. Appreciate it. All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.